Thank you, everyone. Just before I'm going to introduce the speakers for today, if you're in a room, please click on the red button to unmute yourself when you have questions during the question session. On Zoom, you can raise your hand so that I can see you. And without further ado, hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for the 17th Embodied Cognitive Science Seminar. Today we have 3 talks, and the format will be that we have 20 minutes for each talk, followed by 20-minute discussion, and as always, we will pause the recording for the discussions. For the first talk, we are happy to welcome 2 speakers, Robin Zebrowski and Eli McGraw. Robin is a professor of cognitive science, philosophy, and psychology at the Beloit College, Wisconsin. She has been working on questions of artificial life and embodiment for 25 years now. Eli McGraw is an independent scholar. He has been working on problems in participatory sense-making, machine consciousness, and human-robot interaction. And he'll be heading to Indiana University of Bloomington this fall to begin working towards a dual PhD in informatics and cognitive science. Together, they will be talking about how participatory sense-making taken together with sociomorphing can better inform us on the role of embodied artificial systems and social interactions. Robin and Eli, thank you very much for joining us today. Please take it away.
All right. I'm not muted. That's good. Hi, everybody. We're going to be talking about participatory sense-making and sociomorphing and discussing the role of embodied artificial systems in social interaction. So briefly, here's what we're going to be trying to get through. So we're going to start with enactive social cognition, participatory sense-making stuff. We'll talk about what PSM is and how it is used to understand social interaction. Why robotics-based AI needs to pay attention to these new theories regarding interaction. We wrote another paper about this new level of description that's not being measured or modeled. That would be valuable in robotics-based AI. And so this is kind of a continuation of that work. We're going to be talking about where enactive social cognition gets stuck in this conversation. We'll go through the problems with anthropomorphism, the extent to like our unhelpful knee-jerk reactions and the assumptions that we make given anthropomorphizing tendencies. We'll be talking about radical asymmetry and interaction. So basically, we'll be coming to terms with social interaction between a human and a non-human agent. And then finally, we'll sew these concepts together in order to move forward in robotics-based AI by reconceiving interaction and interactors. So we'll start with a provocation. This quote from Hannah de Jaegher, Jaegher Di Paolo, and Sean Gallagher serves to as our little jumping off point. So I'll just read it, I guess. Interactions are social as long as the autonomy of the agents is not dissolved. We do not restrict social interaction to the human species. As long as the terms of the definition can be verified, they can apply to cross-species interactions or interactions with robots that are autonomous in the sense intended. So they mention in pretty vague language that a robot or an animal may be able to fit into the role of an interactor if they are autonomous in the enactive sense. So an animal or robot then could produce a sort of autonomous system, which PSM entails, which we will go into right now-ish. So I like to start this one with the hallway example. It's their go-to example to explain participatory sense-making, and it illustrates the concept well. So we're asked to imagine 2 people trying to pass each other in a hallway and frustratingly mirroring one another instead of successfully fulfilling the intentions of each, which are to simply keep walking. Like when you're trying to get by somebody and you keep bumping into them and oops, neither one of you really wants that to be happening. So the exchange here takes on an autonomy of its own, one which supersedes the intentions of each individual in the hallway, because each wanted to just pass by in this case. And the environmental circumstance sort of complicated that process and became an entity of its own. So the people involved in this interaction coordinated part of the exchange, and the exchange itself fed back and encouraged them to further sustain or modify that exchange. So PSM's general claim some kinds of social interactions produce a kind of cognition or sense making that emerges in the dynamics of the interaction between two sense makers. And that cannot be reduced back to the intentions of the individual actors. So sense makers have a consistent perspective on their world because of the precariousness attached to their self-organization and their self-maintenance, which entails these needs and constraints, which are relevant at multiple levels of their identities and which meaning can be drawn from, allegedly. So this includes like metabolic needs, like your cells need energy, all the way up to sociocultural needs, norms, and values. So I like to use the phrase, I need food and I also need a friend. So these needs and constraints act basically as a source of self-identity for the sense maker. So an interaction process also has emergent dynamic patterns of coordination and breakdown, which parallel the needs and constraints attached to an individual sense maker. These patterns give the process itself a kind of autonomy similar to, if not the same as, kind of the individual sense makers involved. The process becomes a sense-making thing or a cognizing agent or some other synonym in itself. So we're no longer trying to do this simulation theory or theory or even just the interaction theory stuff where you're like applying a simulation into the brain of another person, or you're trying to theorize given your own state about another person's state. So yeah, we're no longer in the head of or being the observer. And we want to make clear also that this is just one way of thinking about autonomy. To backtrack, there are a ton of definitions of autonomy. Like human autonomy means something different than robotic autonomy, and the way that it's written about is pretty inconsistent. So we're basing ours around enactive autonomy, and that is generally based in life processes. So there are a few loose threads left in PSM. For example, what constitutes a sense maker and what's needed to produce an interaction process which fits the criteria necessary to be considered an autonomous sense-making thing in itself remain unclear in some conditions, largely as a result of both the traditional problem of other minds and the empirical facts about human social behavior. There are still problems in describing and determining what constitutes a genuine sense-making system, particularly in regards to robotics, without running into these sorts of epistemological roadblocks, which are complicated by human tendencies toward anthropomorphizing and conflicting ideas of autonomy itself between enactivism and robotics and many other disciplines. So here, we're back to the initial question: how can we slot a robot or an animal into these processes? How can we determine whether they're autonomous in the sense intended? If PSM is going to be a valuable framework for understanding social robotics and future AGI work, then we need to understand the role of the non-human system in that interaction better than any framework currently does. And that leads us into sociomorphing land.
Okay, that part is me. So I put a lot of text on my slides just because I talk really fast. So I apologize in advance that I talk really fast. I'll try and slow down and go over all of the slides. Well, anthropomorphism is obviously problematic in a whole bunch of ways. This is my dog, Rocket. She's a big jerk. She steals things that I own in order to make me chase her to get them back. Her favorite game is being chased, and I hate it. So she steals my things, anything she can get. She steals my child's favorite toys and chews them. And so I'm fairly confident that when I ascribe the mental states that I just did to Rocket, that I'm pretty close, because she enacts this game again and again. And you can tell when she's enjoying the outcome and when she's not. So I think I've got a pretty good idea of what's going on there. But also here we have Sophia the robot. She's gets lots of publicity, but it's a puppet. It's a fancy puppet. And she definitely does not have the kinds of mental states that people tend to attribute to her when she's talking and when she's in interaction. And so we get stuck when we're trying to think about how to put non-human interactors in these kinds of social cognition making interactions anthropomorphism slows us down. It really messes us up. Because again, while I feel pretty safe ascribing the states that Rocket is engaging in to her, I know that she's a dog and she doesn't have the same sorts of complex analysis of that interaction that I have. She probably has something much more simple, like I get this thing and then I play a game. And so we have to get away from anthropomorphizing, both because I don't want to over-ascribe intentions to my dog, and I definitely want other people to stop over-ascribing intentions to something like Sophia, which clearly has nothing. Okay, next slide, Eli. Sorry, you're in control. Okay, so sociomorphing comes to us from Johanna Seibt and her collaborators, Vestergaard and Damholdt. And it's basically the direct perception of real social capacities in agents or systems, including non-human agents. So the way they've described this, and I want to mention that this is embedded in a giant ontology. It has a whole bunch of moving parts, and we're leaving a bunch of it out for the sake of a 20-minute talk. And we're leaving a bunch of it out because we think it doesn't quite do what we want it to do. So we're sort of skimming sociomorphing off the top of her larger project. But the idea is that you really are directly perceiving actual social capacities in other kinds of systems. And it's a kind of forcing us to reconceive those interactions so we stop accidentally anthropomorphizing. So the quote we like from them is, "Such interactions we proposed should not by default and in all cases be viewed," and she's talking here about social robots for the most part, the robots that we know don't have anything like intentionality, but that are designed to look like they do. Such interactions we propose should not by default and in all cases be viewed as involving a mental operation where fictional human capacities for social interaction are imaginatively projected onto the robot, which is how we tend to conceive of these interactions now. Rather, heeding a suitably wide understanding of sociality, we should allow for human social behavior toward robots to be guided by direct and possibly implicit perceptions of actual non-human capacities for social interaction. So again, we're talking about things we're likely already doing. So when we interact with social robots and things like that, we know that they're not humans or animals, and we kind of understand the interaction, or at least many of us do. But at the same time, we're trying to make sense of it by projecting human understandings of the interaction onto that. Okay, next one. So tied up with sociomorphing is what they call the TES, the types of experienced sociality. So we really liked this part a lot because they talk about this as feelings of co-presence with another agent or entity. I've been working a lot with Merleau-Ponty's intercorporeality, and I get really stuck when it comes to some of these things with, especially with social robots, that things that we know aren't actually beings, but we often feel like we're with other beings. And so we keep this from Seibt's work on sociomorphing. Again, we're leaving behind a bunch of the larger ontology for the sake of adapting it to a larger project. But they say sociomorphing can take many forms, each of which is manifested in or otherwise associated with a type of experienced sociality. So new TESs occur when one agent, quote, operates with a second person perspective that deviates from the symmetry assumption. So I'm gonna pause for a second because there's a lot there. If you imagine the interaction, right, there are multiple perspectives. There's me interacting with maybe my dog. So there's the first person, my experience. And then there's how I imagine the dog is experiencing the interaction. So there's that second person way of seeing the thing. And they say that it's when the second person perspective is operative is when these new types of experienced sociality are relevant. And a portion of any given TES touches on a feeling of co-presence or being with a particular social interactor. So again, if you know something like Merleau-Ponty's intercorporeality, we're getting really close to that with this description. And so imagine the phenomenological distinction between what it feels like to be in a shared space with a dog or cat You know that you're in a room with a living thing that has projects and intentions of its own, but you also know that it's not the same as if a human were in the room with you. Versus if you've ever been around some of the social robots, like a Pepper robot or something like that, the experience is different. You feel differently about what you're present with. And they acknowledge that in some cases, these capacities may be perceptually indistinguishable from corresponding human capacities. So in other words, when I think that my dog has a desire to be chased and to play this game, it's quite possible that that's really close to what's happening here. And there's a whole ontology built here that, again, we're kind of sweeping under the rug because it's built on simulation, and we're trying to apply this work to robotics-based AGI work rather than social robots proper. And so the feeling of co-presence is relevant in each case, but the types of experience sociality changes given differing expectations of the situation, including things like anticipated responsive capabilities and environmental circumstances. So when I tell my dog to stop stealing things, that she's being a jerk, that I have work to do, that I don't want to chase her, I already anticipate what her response is going to be. She's going to give me that look where her eyes are up and she's just daring me to come chase her anyway. Whereas a person would have a different reaction to me getting angry. The dog does not. Okay, next slide, Eli. So these are two quotes from people interacting with robots that we loved, and we think that these really speak to this concept of types of experience sociality. So this first one is Sherry Turkle, way back in 1995, writing about the very first time she walked into the room where Cog, who there's a picture of here, was being tested. And Turkle's always been a skeptic. Turkle knew exactly what Cog was and what it could do. And so this is the quote: "Cog noticed me soon after I entered its room. Its head turned to follow me, and I was embarrassed to note that this made me happy. I found myself competing with another visitor for its attention. Despite myself and despite my continuing skepticism about this research project, I had behaved as though in the presence of another being." So again, she knows that this is a different kind of system, that it's not human, that it's not animal, that it doesn't have the kinds of intentions that its movements appear to have. And yet she feels this co-presence with Cog. This other quote is from Kate Darling, just in 2021. Darling had also spent a lot of time at MIT's Media Lab, was used to lots of broken robots not doing anything they were supposed to do. And she recounts this anecdote where she's given a tour at Boston Dynamics, and this is in her book from last year. And she saw a robot slumped against the wall, and she's like, "Oh yeah, got a lot of those." And then her tour guide opened a door, and she says, "My jaw dropped. Behind the door was a gymnasium-sized hall outfitted with an elaborate obstacle course. Dozens of dog-sized robots were roaming the premises, walking up and down stairs, pacing back and forth in pens, or ambling around the area completely by themselves." Even the language she uses here is language you'd use about dogs, right? You keep dogs in pens and they pace back and forth in that space. So again, Darling knew exactly what these animals, these robotic animals, these creatures were capable of, and yet she feels as though she's just been introduced to this space full of other beings. And again, part of the motivation of us taking this particular framework is that anthropomorphism messes us up so much. We need to stop anthropomorphizing these systems, but we haven't got the right language for it. And part of that is what sociomorphing is offering us. And we're also motivated just by the idea that non-humans in social interactions, it's controversial. We found piles and piles of literature reviews of people trying to talk about non-humans in social interaction, and it's a mess. Okay, next slide, Eli. We're almost done, I promise. We kept it short. So sociomorphing takes one tiny piece of the problem away from us. So we're not drowning in both the anthropomorphism and the messy metaphysics of what's actually happening with this system, right? Ultimately, we have to deal with those things, especially the metaphysics. But this is a way of trying to do actual research with robots that doesn't rely on anthropomorphism, because we know we're getting bad analyses when we do that. So it makes space for us to consider the ways that non-human actors might or might not fit into social sense-making interactions. We know that they fit pretty well into social interactions in some cases, but we're interested in the cases where that rises to the level of social cognition and sense-making. And so we're suggesting to use sociomorphing to build a new concept of what social sense-making might look like with non-human agents. And we think that this framework goes a really long way in helping us do that. Okay, next slide. Yes, awesome. Okay, here are the sources that we used, and more importantly, the final slide. This will be live very soon. It was just, I just submitted the proofs again a week ago. It's going to be in the BioAI from Embodied Cognition to Enactive Robotics research topic in Frontiers for Neurorobotics. And it gives you a whole lot of the details that we skimmed over to keep this in 20 minutes because there's a lot. And I'm sorry we skipped a ton, but we hope you have the sense of what we're up to here. And that's it. Thank you.